Good day, guys. Today is Monday, May the 17th. We have about a week left of class, and we are going to finish this unit. And I'm going to sneeze, and forgive me for doing this. In fact, I'll hide. That's better. Okay. So today we're going to start off with the conflict between the new state of Israel, which was founded in 1948, and the surrounding Arab states that almost since the state was founded, the Israeli state has had to fight for his life. Um, there's a tendency in the United States to always sympathize with the Jewish state of Israel. But as you study more, you find that this is a problem that has no easy solutions, and it's very difficult to sit there and say that one side is right and one side is not right. Uh, it's also a very dangerous thing. I mean, I have had a number of students that I have tremendous respect for that are Muslim, uh, because remember, Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and that Islam is the second fastest growing faith in the world. And therefore, you can't just say Jews are right, Arabs are wrong, Muslims are wrong. That's just wrong-headed. And so let's begin, shall we? There. All right. One of the possible flashpoints for a global confrontation has been the Near East, and I forgot to get a map, which I'm going to do now. Pause again. And we are back again. And so, yeah. So, it's been the Near East. So, what are you talking about when you're talking about the Near East? This is the Near East. This map is titled the Monotheism Map because it refers to the lands where Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were born, which is right here, but that had influence. In other words, all this territory here, this is, if you go to Sunday school, study the Bible, this area in here is basically what the Bible centers itself around, pretty much. And so, yeah, back to it, back to this, there. So, what is Zionism? Zionism is the belief Jews should have a homeland and that homeland should be in Palestine. Say, where's Palestine? This is Palestine. So, and you're in the wrong place. Getting back to it. Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann founded Zionism in 1896, founded the Zionism movement. Well, that's terrible. In 1896. And began making noise and clamoring and appealing to governments, particularly the British government, to agree with them that they should have their own country. The Balfour Declaration, made by the British government in 1917, was a document endorsed by the British government saying, yeah, there should be a national homeland for Jews in Palestine. And they turned right around and said the same thing to the Arabs, that you should have a homeland in Palestine. Many Jews around the world began to flock to the land of Palestine to establish homes there, which in turn displaced the Arab-speaking Palestinians who'd been living there for 2,000 years. The Yishuv The Yishuv is the uprising, the resistance against the Israelis. The horrors of the Holocaust in Europe that, during World War II, I'm sorry we couldn't spend more time talking about, but 6 million Jews being murdered systematically in Europe probably did more to elevate sympathy for the Jewish cause than for all the works of the Zionists throughout history. And so in 1947, the British turned over to the United Nations the troubling questions of what to do about Jews in Palestine. The UN took a middle course. That means the UN declared there should be both an Arab state and a Jewish state in Israel, or rather in Palestine. And many Palestinian Arabs were displaced. They basically, the Israelis came and shoved them out of there. In fact, we have a lot of their descendants, those Arab Palestinians, living in this area. I've taught some of them, and they're still quite resentful about that. In May of 1948, the State of Israel declared its independence, and with the recognition of the United States coming almost immediately, Israel was invaded by Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. The United States and the Soviet Union were almost immediately drawn into this shoving match because the United States supported Israel, the Soviet Union wanted sympathy with the Arab states, they sided with the Arab states, and yeah, it was a mess. And then you throw in the fact that at that time, 1948, something like 70% of the world's known 70% of the world's known oil reserves, basically you're looking at it right here, this area here. And I said known oil reserves. They didn't know about the other oil reserves they've found since then. They've had to dig a lot deeper. But yes. Important. Go back. And there. So the United States established firm ties with Israel, and that lasts to this very day. Now, I don't know if you keep up with current events, but you should. You really should. The world moves a lot faster than it did when I was a child, and it's not that I'm that old. It moved a lot faster when I was a child than it did, when my parents were children. The world moves, boys and girls, the world moves at an exponentially increasing, in other words, changes come at an exponentially increasing rate. And I'd love to sit there and discuss that with you, but just take my word on it. I mean, I grew up in a world, my first home did not have a phone at all. No phone. And I wasn't, our family was not alone in that. Where we lived, few people had phones. And then one day, people got phones, but the problem was the phone we had was, of course, a landline. But the phone we had, the line we shared with several of our neighbors. So that if we'd pick up the phone, we might hear our neighbors talking to somebody else, and you had to wait your turn. And that's several families. And then, of course, these, and all the things you can do with those. And that has changed so rapidly. And they still are changing. So, think about it. I can talk, I talk to people on the other side of the world with these. It's incredible. That would not have been imagined when I was a child or when I was a young adult. You could do it, but it cost you a fortune. Now it costs nothing. So, back to the matter at hand. Let's talk about Korea. Up until the defeat of Japan in World War II, Korea had been a Japanese colony over the last few centuries. When World War II ended, Korea was one of those parts of the old Japanese empire that had to be administered over. The Soviet Union and the United States divided the administrative duties of Korea at the 38th parallel north latitude, approximately. It was expected that soon that the two Koreas would be reunited, but as with Germany, Cold War tensions got in the way. The southern half of Korea became a democratic-style government under Syngman Rhee in 1948 with the backing of the United States. It became known as the ROK, Republic of Korea, or simply more commonly known South Korea. The Soviet Union influenced the northern half of Korea, and Kim Il-sung, who, by the way, is the grandfather of that bozo And if I were to go to North Korea and say he was a bozo, I would be executed. But yeah, that bozo who's always threatening the United States with nuclear weapons. This is his grandfather. That bozo who had his own brother murdered in Vietnam for fear that he might try to take his power. Yeah. There were many border clashes between the two Koreas. In late June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the United States intervened on the behalf of the South Koreans. The United States, became known as the Korean War, although it was never a war, it was a police action. Tell that to the people, the 30,000 Americans who died. So, the United States sent the lion's share of military aid and bore the brunt of the war. Britain, Turkey, and Australia also sent token forces. The UN Security Council voted to support the Americans in that action. The Soviet Union, who normally would have voted against it, had walked out the day before to protest something else the United States had done. So they weren't there for the vote, therefore the vote passed without it. Technically speaking, this was never a war but a police action by the United Nations. By late of 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II, had pushed the North Korean forces almost to China. The Communist Chinese reacted as if this was a threat to their border and sent in thousands of so-called volunteers to drive back the Americans. The Americans were driven back by sheer force of numbers, and the popular MacArthur was fired by Harry Truman, the president, because, as he said, and he was the first person ever to say this, Douglas MacArthur said he wanted to nuke the Chinese back to the Stone Age. Yeah. And President Truman fired him. The war dragged on for 2 more years until the line began to stabilize once again around the same 38th parallel. For what it's worth, the communist Chinese under Mao Zedong were not working in cooperation with the Soviet Union, although most Americans believe that to be true. Newly president, Dwight David Eisenhower, was elected on a campaign of bringing the boys home. With an armistice signed on June 16, 1953, the war was put an end. There, however, still to this day remains a major United States troop presence in South Korea. I mean, there's a big United States Army presence there. And also, the 38th parallel remains one of the most volatile flashpoints in the world. U.S. military advisors and diplomatic think tanks, in other words, people who think about this kind of stuff, felt that the containment idea had stopped the spread of communism in Korea as it had in Europe. Okay. Several things occurred, moving back to Europe, which greatly affected the course of the Cold War. Joseph Stalin finally died. The Soviets pulled out of Austria in 1955 because of a treaty, and also it was not in their interest to control that particular European state. Later in 1955, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union held a summit conference in Geneva, Switzerland. Basically sit down and talk about differences. There were many troubling issues such as nuclear arms control, future of Germany, how it was split, human rights, and many people had high hopes for these talks. This was called the Spirit of Geneva. In reality, they didn't get much done. So, Joseph Stalin's own daughter denounced him, but only after his death. I mean, Stalin was he gets shortchanged, for bad guys. There are, I think, 3 of the worst people who lived in the 20th century. Of course, Adolf Hitler ranks number 1, but Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong of China, who we're going to become familiar with, we're going to go back and visit Puyi. Trust me, we're going to finish that film. Don't cry. And we'll see Mao Zedong. Joseph Stalin had been a hardliner against warmer relations with the United States and the West, and with his death came hope that things would get better. After Stalin died, the power of government was gradually placed in the hands of Nikita Khrushchev. While Khrushchev was not as repressive as Stalin, the Kremlin was still a repressive government. The Kremlin. Kremlin's, the reference is like saying the White House. The Soviet government was centered in the Kremlin. It's a giant building in Red Square in Moscow. Khrushchev did allow for some intellectual freedoms that would have never been allowed during the Stalinist regime. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was allowed to be published. However, Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was not allowed. And you're saying, I don't know either of those books. I remember a movie about Dr. Zhivago when I was a kid. I didn't go see it, but both of them were about Russia and life in Russia. One was allowed to be published, the other wasn't, probably because the other was more critical. Khrushchev's Russia also tried to liberate the economy. The economy was turned ever so slightly in the direction of improving consumer goods, which had always been in short supply. In the communist system, which had to this point been geared to heavy industry, the Soviets put the first, now here was the big kicker, in 1956, the year I was born. Coincidence? I think not. The Soviets put the first unmanned, yes, I'm 65, shut up. Put the first unmanned satellite, or will be soon, into space. And the satellite, called Sputnik, was about the size of my desk if my desk was a solid object. And they put it in, and it was just a radio satellite. It reflected radio signals. Very simple thing compared to what they can do now. But it scared the poop out of the United States. I mean, it really did. If the Soviets could put something like that up there, how soon will it be before they start putting weapons in space that would be out of reach of anything we had, of course? And what that does is that it basically kicked the United States into gear to start its own space program. But to do that, the United States, first of all, depended upon a lot of did I say Nazi? I guess I said Nazi. A lot of Nazi space engineers that after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union divided them between it. The most famous one in the United States was a guy named Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi. He built the famous V-1 and V-2 rockets during World War II that they weren't very accurate, but they were able to reach from Berlin to London. And so he invented those. If you've ever been to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, he built a lot of that. Pardon me. That was one thing. So they used these German space engineers. The other thing was that the United States government began spending tons of money. Title I, it was called, on math and science programs in high school. They've kind of fallen away from that now. But yeah, the United States spent tons of money, going into high schools and refurbishing laboratories and things of that nature. Yeah, because that's how you get to space, math and science. History? No, that's how you talk about space. Losers. Anyway, Khrushchev even went so far as to publicly condemn the policies of Joseph Stalin in the fields of human rights. Members of Stalin's inner circle were gradually voted out of the presidium of the Soviet government, and Eastern Bloc nations, Poland, began to believe they could have some greater leeway. Now, one more thing. Here we go. 14. In 1956, a great year. A crisis in the Suez Canal almost caused an international conflict, but oddly enough, the United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side. Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was a general in the Egyptian army, seized power in 1952 and took over the Suez Canal. War broke out between Egypt and Israel, and Britain and France used that as an excuse to get military involved with the hope of regaining the Suez Canal, which formerly had been controlled by British and French interests. That intervention was at first successful, with the Anglo-French alliance occupying the canal. You say, why did Britain and France do that? They wanted money. You see, Britain and France used to own controlling commercial interest in the Suez Canal. Suez Canal would go right through here. It is a shortcut from Europe to the rest of the world. And here's the thing. Britain and France own a controlling interest of this canal, And that meant every time a ship passed through there, Britain and France got paid. Then Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it, took it over, kicked the British and French out, and the British and French, well, can't do anything until there was a war between Egypt and Israel. And the British and French joined the war so that they could be on the money again. However, the United States refused to support the action, and the Soviet Union downright vehemently opposed it. Therefore, the British and the French had to withdraw. That showed that and that's what's important, any European military action could not operate without the United States. This was called the Suez Crisis of 1956. And that's where we're going to end, boys and girls, for today.